I'm Irwin Sarason, and several weeks ago I distributed a questionnaire and asked Horizon House residents to respond to it. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the things that came out of that, where the whole idea came from, and make some comments about what was found. The general idea behind the questionnaire was that we know very little about what people see when they look back on their lives. We're busy with the present, and there's a lot of forgetting also. And how do we make decisions, and what's the role of chance? And I've been thinking about those questions for years and years, and not only have I not done anything about the questions, no one has really looked at these questions to find out what people see when they look back. So what I distributed was, I guess, what you might call a pilot study. And an example of where the whole thing came from was something that occurred 50 years ago. And it emerged in a conversation that I had with a friend of mine, Al Bandura, who's a psychologist at Stanford. And we were chatting. I don't even remember how we got onto the topic, but I happened to mention to him that I would never have met my wife had it not been for the fact that when she was on a job in Chicago, her supervisor had gotten his PhD at the University of Iowa and had suggested that when she went to graduate school, she might want to go there. And I went to Iowa because I had been told that you got very good methodological training there. But had somebody suggested to me going someplace else, I might have followed that suggestion. And certainly if Barbara's supervisor were not from the University of Iowa, she would not have gone there. And it's interesting that I was telling this to my son a couple of months ago, and I pointed out to him that had those kind of accidents not occurred, my life would be different, my wife's life would have been different. And he looked at me and he said, and what about my life? So, and then in the course of the conversation with Al, he said, well, you know, I met my wife when I was playing golf, and there was a backup for people to tee, and the person that he married happened to be just in back of them. And they had a little chat, and that chat led to some other things. And he said that he felt that chance had played a tremendous role in his life. Let me just remind you of what the questionnaire was about. It asked you to list positive and negative chance events, that is, things that you had not expected that happened and that had either positive or negative effects. And the same question was asked with regard to decisions that a person makes that either have good consequences or bad consequences. And let me tell you a little bit now about what was said, what the Horizon House residents said. The major chance events in the lives of Horizon House residents could perhaps be put into 4 groups. And this is based on the preponderance of responses to the questionnaire. 1, just as was true with me and with Al Bandura, meeting spouses and factors related to marriage was perhaps the #1 topic mentioned in responses. Another large class of responses had to do with work experiences, changes in interests, why those changes took place. Another large group had to do with school experiences, having a particular teacher at a particular time. And the fourth probably could be described as social relationships, getting to know someone under unusual circumstances, perhaps. And I thought I would give you a few examples of the positive events and the negative events that people describe. So these are roughly quotations. One was, a teacher told me that I had a nice voice, and as a result of that I took some lessons, and I've done a lot of singing in my life since. I met my husband on a blind date. I grew up in a state where college costs were low, thus enabling me to go to college. A teacher encouraged me to go to graduate school. And I might just mention that I've had some experiences with that. For example, I had one student who was an undergraduate at the University of Washington, and he took a course that I was giving, and I was telling him about some research that I was doing, and he got involved in that and interested in it. And he ended up going on for a PhD in psychology, and he once commented to me that had he not had that experience with me, he probably would have gotten a job at Frederick & Nelson for the rest of his life. So he felt his life had really been changed. Another response was, I sat next to someone in a school's cafeteria who became a lifelong friend. We just happened to sit next to each other. Another person said, a boss who told me how good I was suggested that I go into that person's field. And this is what I really described with the student that I had had. I bought property that I liked and sold it for a high price. So sometimes money is a factor. And these are some examples of negative events. I failed the high school course that I was taking. I had an unwanted pregnancy. I had a concussion that resulted from an accident. I didn't get a job that I wanted because the interviewer, I found out later, had a friend who got the job. I was assaulted while walking in a park. My brother was killed in an accident. I was sexually assaulted at a young age. And actually, I found that quite interesting because there's been a recent study done on the effects of bad experiences that children have. And the negative event in the life of children, negative events in the lives of children that have the greatest effects later on, bad effects, are sexual assaults. Sometimes these negative events have consequences that you might not predict. For example, no one in my family, until my brother went to college, not only ever went to college, ever finished high school. And it was assumed that my brother, who was 11 years older than I was, it was assumed that he would get a job in a factory. When he was 15, he had polio. and it was obvious that he was never going to be able to work in a factory. And with the help of the New Jersey Rehabilitation Commission, he was able to go to a college, get a bachelor's degree, and he eventually became a professor at Yale, where he was a professor for over 40 years. A year before my brother died, he and I were just chatting, and he said, he commented to me that he didn't know how to conceptualize the polio that he had had. That obviously a 15-year-old boy getting polio is a terrible tragedy, which of course it is. But my brother went on to say that he had led what he regarded as a very advantaged life, a life full of experiences that he never could have possibly imagined. And then it occurred to me that I would never have gone to college had Seymour not gone to college, because it just was not part of the thinking of the people in the family. So that Seymour's polio and going to college kind of changed the culture of the family. I wanted to just make a couple of comments about these events that occur in the lives of people. One thing that was evident was that positive events are much more easily remembered and reported than negative events. And in fact, a few people wrote comments to the effect that, you know, they could think of some of the good things, but they either couldn't or didn't want to think about the bad things that had happened. But several people described several bad experiences that were not a result of chance. And in any subsequent work, a lot of thought would have to be given to phrasing the question more clearly, because I think some people in this particular instance were talking about events that occurred, and it was not always completely clear that it was a chance event. And that raises the question, of course, of what is chance? A lot of things happen in our lives that are unexpected, kind of as a result of things that we have done. The questionnaire also asked about decisions that people make and the good and the bad outcomes of the decisions that they have made. And these are some of the responses that came forth. I took a lower paying job, but it was a better job, and I'm glad that I did. Actually, I found that response very interesting, because I came to the University of Washington in 1956, and the legislature had been very bad to the university in that year. As a result, the salary that they offered me was $4,860 for 9 months, with the possibility that I might be able to teach summer school sometime. All of my friends who were pretty much in the same situation I was thought I would be absolutely crazy to come to the University of Washington, because everybody else was getting salaries quite a bit more than that. It obviously worked out, because a few years ago I got a plaque signed by the president of the university noting my 60th year on the faculty at the University of Washington. Another response was, I took a year off after high school and developed a new, fulfilling interest and career. So it was the decision, should I take a year off or should I not? I went to college instead of taking a job. I volunteered to be a nurse in Africa, and that changed my life. I decided to marry after many doubts. I worked as a volunteer and later got a job with the agency where I was volunteering. Some people here will be happy. The next response, I joined the League of Women Voters. If I were giving you my response, one of the things I would put down as decisions was a decision to write a book. I wrote a book when I was 29. As I look back upon it, I really didn't know enough to write the book, but I did, and it changed my life, despite all the doubts that I had. Let me give you a couple of examples of negative decisions made with negative outcomes. I married the wrong person and got a divorce. I took the wrong courses in college that led to absolutely nothing. I had an extramarital affair. I decided to go directly from high school to college, and I was too immature. I should have taken some time off. I accepted demanding jobs that led me to neglect my children. I got married at too young an age, and a divorce resulted. I bought stocks when they were high and sold when they were low. I think some people are a little worried about that today. I neglected friendships because of preoccupations that I had with my work. Let me just mention two observations about the decisions that people made. One, again, as with events in people's lives, social ties and decisions related to them predominate over almost all other kinds of responses. And again, people, and some people commented on this, people found it much easier to talk about the quote, positive decisions that they made as contrasted with the negative ones. The major finding, I found this extremely interesting. The major finding of the questionnaire, which I don't think I would have predicted, is that negative decisions that people make often have positive outcomes. And the reason is whether it's a positive decision, a good decision or a bad decision, the key thing in how people deal with decisions and how they deal with the events that occur in their lives is how they cope. What a person brings to a situation seems to be decisive. And there's actually a lot of evidence regarding that finding. That is, the finding that what people bring to situations has a lot to do with how they handle the situation. An example of this, just to give you something out of the literature, they had several earthquakes in New Zealand several years ago, and some researchers just happened to have a lot of information about the people who experienced the earthquake. And what they found was people who, prior to the earthquake, seemed to be living relatively well-adjusted lives, coped nicely with the horrors of the earthquake. People who had had a lot of problems in their lives a lot of unhappiness, did not work out that way. And actually, a similar kind of finding relates to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that soldiers are more likely to develop problems as a result of wartime experiences if, prior to going into service, they had had difficulties in their lives. An example of a positive outcome to a bad event was someone who said, "My husband died and I learned to be an independent person." Another person said, "An early illness helped me appreciate life more than I had before." Another person said, "I had a serious accident and I learned to be more self-reliant." And this was a fairly common thread, and there's evidence backing up the idea, and that is dealing with the situation depends on what you bring to the situation and how willing you are to deal with the situation. Another person said, "I didn't get a job that I wanted. I took another one in an unrelated field, and I spent the rest of my life working on that, in that field." Just the other day, I came across what I think is a perfect example of this general finding from the Horizon House study, and that is the importance of coping. One of the, probably the greatest singer at the Metropolitan Opera today is someone by the name of Joyce DiDonato. She's absolutely marvelous. And I just happened to see an interview that she gave about how her career developed. And the interviewer asked her, "Well, did you ever have any bumps in the road?" And she said, "Oh, yes. And let me tell you about the worst of them." In 1996, when she was just beginning her music career and had a lot to learn, she entered a vocal competition that was held in Denmark. And one of the judges, and she did not win, or get any of the prizes. So she felt badly about that. And after the prizes had been awarded, there was a little reception, and one of the judges, who was a distinguished music critic, chatted with her and told her, "You know, I think you ought to consider going into teaching. That I don't think you have the right stage presence. Your voice doesn't have the control that it does." And there were two things that hit Joyce DiDonato. One, this man who was telling her all these terrible things seemed to have nothing but good intentions. He was trying to help Joyce DiDonato. And the other was that she was absolutely shaken. When she got back to the United States, she said she essentially cried for 2 weeks and didn't know what to do, and felt that, you know, she'd been wasting a lot of time. And then after about 2 weeks, she began focusing on something which she had actually observed earlier. And that is that this man seemed to have good intentions. He wasn't trying to hurt her, he was trying to help her. And she began asking herself, well, are there any things that I could do differently from the way I'm doing them now? Well, as a result of her reconsideration, she went back to music school for a year, changed the way she did a lot of little things, like the way she would stand by the piano when she would be singing a song. And she now spends a lot of time giving master classes to young people who aspire to be opera singers. And in fact, in the video that I saw, you could see her interacting with these young people and working as hard as she was to be kind and thoughtful to them and to be helpful also. I'd like to conclude simply by noting that if I were to do this all over again, I would do some things differently. I would try to distinguish better between positive events and negative events. That is, events over which one has some control and over which one does not. But it occurred to me the other day that another thing I would consider adding to the questionnaire would be what was the best and what was the worst period of your life. I think I thought about that because in the responses that Horizon House residents made, there were many more references to things that happened a long time ago than things that are going on now, although that was dealt with by many, period. And it would be interesting, I think, for all of us to think about what was the best period of your life and what was the worst one. And at least for me, I wouldn't have a moment's hesitation in describing the best period of my life. And I don't know whether other people would find this as easy as I found it. That period, by the way, was the period roughly between the ages of 24 and 35. That's just a guess. And why was it the best period of my life? I think it was because it was a time during which I was building a family, having children, having mutual responsibilities with family members, and working at the job that I had. And I think another thing I would ask about, and by the way, the period that I just described as maybe the best period of my life was the period during which I worried the most about money. So you tend to think that if you have enough money, you're not going to have to worry too much. And that might be true in certain respects. I think I would also ask people to say a little bit about what they regard as their personal strengths and assets. So the conclusion that I come to is that life is not just a matter of one thing after another. It's about how we deal with events, how we view things, and how we modify some aspects of our lives in order to deal with the events that occur. So thank all of you who filled it out. I really appreciate it.